On Monday, the Supreme Court allowed lawsuits brought by municipalities that are trying to hold energy companies accountable for climate change. So the Supreme Court said, you know what, we're just going to let this move forward. We are not going to intervene. The court turned away oil company appeals in 5 different cases involving claims brought by cities and municipalities in Colorado, Maryland, California, Hawaii, and Rhode Island as part of efforts to hold businesses accountable for the effects of climate change. Wonderful. So now, that said, it's a pretty narrow victory here. And let me explain. So this basically has decided whether or not these lawsuits should be heard in state courts instead of in federal courts. So why does that matter? Well, litigants say that there is a widely held view that plaintiffs just do better at winning damage awards in state courts instead of federal courts. And so basically they're saying, well, we would like to go to the state courts so that we actually have a chance of winning against these gigantic corporations. And look, the implication there, and it wouldn't be an incorrect implication, that these oil companies have a lot of influence on these federal courts. So having a victory, in the Supreme Court, making it so that they can have their cases heard before these state courts instead of a federal court means that they have a better chance of winning these cases and actually getting damages. And if enough of that happens, well, that could mean these companies might be forced from a financial perspective to change tack and to be a little bit more wary of their emissions. Let's just say that. So now, let me give you a quote here from Richard Wiles, president of the Center for Climate Integrity, which is a pro-environmental group, who celebrated this, saying, big oil companies have been desperate to avoid trials in state courts where they will be forced to defend their climate lies in front of juries. And today, the Supreme Court declined to bail them out. Awesome. Now, business groups had expressed disappointment in the Supreme Court's decision, which automatically makes me think this is a good decision. Now, the Biden administration also urged the court not to hear the cases. And wow, for some reason, the Supreme Court actually listened. That is weird. I didn't expect that. In all 5 cases, by the way, companies including BP, Chevron, and Shell had lost in the lower courts, which means, again, with these municipalities being able to take these companies to court over climate change and get damages, that's kind of a big deal. The Supreme Court was the last stop for them. Now, the municipalities' lawsuits say that they have been harmed by the effects of climate change caused by carbon emissions that the oil companies are heavily responsible for, oil and gas. And so that's a big change from what the Supreme Court had been doing before. But again, this is a very narrow issue. So it's not like the Supreme Court changed from being incredibly pro-oil. They just didn't have the chance to rule on these individual cases. And to illustrate that, cases before, like in 2021, remember the Supreme Court ruled in favor of oil companies. Now, this was in a procedural issue in a similar lawsuit brought by the city of Baltimore, and last year limited the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency to address climate change under a provision of the Clean Air Act. And so, don't worry, if you're concerned that the Supreme Court is suddenly going pro-environmental and pro-woke or some weirdo stuff like that, unfortunately, that's not the case. I wish they were. I wish they were going more pro-environment, but no. But at least, hey, you now have these state courts that will decide whether or not these cities have been damaged by fossil fuel emissions. And so there's some possibility of accountability. That's something. That's something. Now, that said, if it only leads to the companies just paying a fine and moving on, then that's not a good thing, because we're still basically there. Yes, the city may, gets some money from these oil companies, maybe to clean things up a little bit, invest a little bit more in their schools or something like that. And that's not the best outcome, because the best outcome would be to, how about make it so that these companies don't harm these communities in the first place, so that they don't accrue these damages. Because once you have that, it basically, these lawsuits, litigation against them will just end up being a cost of doing business, and they already make tons and tons of money to begin with, and so of course they could afford that cost of doing business, whereas we as as humanity, we can't really afford that cost, the cost of our communities, the cost of our climate. So that said, business groups aren't happy about it. That's something. I'll take that as a small win, and we'll see what happens from here.